Hello, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to the first of our fall monthly meeting series. We're extremely excited to start this session with you. Before we begin, we will have some logistic announcements, if you could bear with us. So our new monthly meeting series is called Another World is Possible, Feminist Answers to Big Questions. And we hope that this series will actually give us hope and support our conviction for collective action towards the much overdue systems change we need. We start the discussion by challenging the current macroeconomic system, and we'll continue to talk about environmental systemic challenges, militarism, peace, control over our bodies, and in the end, we will finish the year with a strong meeting on how we can ensure that mobilize to ensure for these systemic changes happen. So before we begin, if we could go to the new slide, please let me remind you of some accessibility and logistics notes. And then our moderator will introduce the meeting. We'll have amazing speakers who will talk about feminist perspectives to macroeconomics and unravel some of the issues before our collective discussion at the end. If we could go to the next slide, please. We also stand in solidarity with all the feminists who couldn't be here today, and with all the feminists resisting all forms of oppression as we speak throughout the world. We have interpretation to Spanish and French. If we could kindly go to the next slide. Please select the language you'd like to listen to the meeting in using the globe sign at the bottom right of your screens. You should also select English if you would like to listen in English. Please do not remain in the off channel. And our interpreters are amazing, but it is always very helpful to them if we speak slowly, keeping in mind the interpretation. So thank you all from the beginning. Andrea and I will be your accessibility and safety coordinators in this call. You can always write to us in the chat if you have any accessibility, safety, or connection concerns. I'd also like to note that our meeting is only open to Women's Major Group members as participants, but we will record the first hour of the meeting and share it on our YouTube and social media channels as a resource. The open discussion at the end will not be recorded, so that will be a more open space where we can discuss these issues. We also hope to have an article, kind of an op-ed as an output of the series, as we always do, in addition to the videos we will have. If you would like to contribute to this article, op-ed, please email us at the Secretariat and we can include you in the preparations of this output. As always, this is a safe space, so discriminatory remarks, hate speech, the denial of self-proclaimed identities, anti-race discourse, and other kinds of discrimination against folks and groups speaking in these meetings will not be tolerated, as well as continuous disruption of the meeting. If such an incident occurs, the person will be removed the Zoom platform after one warning. We want to ensure that this is a safe space for us to share. So without further ado, if we can go to the next meeting, next slide, I'd like to pass the floor to our Asia organizing partner, APWLD's April Portera, to moderate our meeting today. Thank you so much, April. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Shahnaz. Can everyone hear me clearly? Okay. Good evening, everyone. It's 10:30 p.m. in Manila, but I am here. Really excited to be with you on this very exciting first session of the monthly meeting series. And as mentioned, this is the first installment of the Women's Major Group monthly meeting series. From this month until December, we'll be focusing on deep diving on macro and systemic issues as well as feminist alternatives. So I am April Portilla from the Asia Pacific Forum on Women, Law and Development. APWLD is a regional network of feminist organizations, activists working towards women's human rights and development justice. And as Ines mentioned, we're the Women's Major Group Asia organizing partner. So for today's session, we are delving into the question of transforming our economic system. And we'll talk about the needed transformative shifts. We know that the 2030 agenda is far from being achieved, and data shows this is actually very alarming, right? So I remember the Asia Pacific, the ESCAP report stating that with the current pace of governments, the available data, we're likely to achieve the SDGs by 2065. A very bleak photo and a hard to imagine reality, the contrast of what we have hoped for in the Rio summit. But today, we are deep diving further into the systemic barriers that surround economic and gender justice and the achievement of genuine sustainable development. We are joined by two dedicated feminist activists from different regions to share on their work and analysis on different economic justice issues. So first, we are glad to have today Bhumika Muchhala of Third World Network to share on the aspect of reparations and debt justice, and Emilia Reyes of Equidad and Campaign of Campaigns to share analysis on degrowth and resource justice. So we have a very exciting duo of feminists that will answer the big questions. And just to remind Bhumika and Emilia, you will have 20 minutes each to answer these big questions. But we would also like to note that we also invited our colleagues from the Global Alliance for Tax Justice, but due to an emergency, Aurea and Caroline could not join us. So maybe later we can still connect with them because definitely their work, especially on the feminist taxation, is very relevant to what we will be talking about today. So also to remind everyone, if you have any questions or comments or sharings, you may use the chat box or wait for the open forum right after the presentations. Okay, so for our first big question, this is very timely, no? Since we're also talking about recovery from COVID-19, and most countries now in the global south are in a deep, deep debt crisis, no? So we would like to ask Bhumika. Bhumika is already here, right? Hi, Bhumika. So we know that any effort to transform the dominant global economic systems must include a decolonial approach that focuses on reparations and debt justice. But what exactly encompasses these feminist proposals for debt justice and reparations? And why are these demands so important to mainstream? And how will they transform our economies? So, Bhumika, I give you the floor now. And yeah, if you have any presentations to share, please feel free.
Hi, hello. I hope you can see and hear me. Greetings, and this is really fantastic to be part of the first Women's Major Group monthly meeting series. This is an incredible idea. I wholly support it. And the fact that it will be put on a channel and made accessible. And I'm also noticing the amount of care and consideration that was put into the safety rules and the accessibility and the interpretation. So I wanted to thank you on all those levels. This is much appreciated. So I'm really excited to be here with all of you, friends, comrades, longtime allies. I have been participating with the Women's Major Group for many years, going back to Rio Plus 20, as well as the Sustainable Development Goals negotiations and many different processes and events and conferences in the UN, from financing for development to various meetings and the LDC conference as well. So I come here now I have spoken with, I have shared and I've been working on and I've been researching and writing various different articulations of global systemic transformation and economic justice. especially since 2020, in solidarity and in collaboration with my longtime ally, Emilia Reyes. We have been working on the concept of a decolonial and feminist global Green New Deal. And at this point, at this juncture, there is really a growing conversation that's very critical regarding reparations. And what does reparations mean in the context of the imperial and colonial, patriarchal, neoliberal global economy? What do economic reparations look like that tie history to the present moment? So I wanted to start with this idea of decolonial and his holistic reparations. And by that meaning the structural, the systemic, as well as the epistemic, which addresses the way in which knowledge is presented and disseminated, what is chosen to be as knowledge, what economics are we taught, what is erased, what is not taught, what is not disseminated, and how does that then shape the world we live in? So the first thing with reparations, the idea of it is that it involves with historicizing and politicizing the global economy through unpacking not just the policies, not just the information, but also the logics, the narratives and mechanisms. And this ranges from the institutional, such as the creation of the Bretton Woods, IMF and World Bank, as well as the psychological, the way that threats and risks are presented in the global economy. So this allows for a process of exposing and understanding the deeper belief systems and structures and narratives that facilitate colonial and capitalist power over not just the current moment and not just the last 40 years of neoliberalism, but over the last several centuries. So such a process of tracing is not just about going back into history, but it is about looking at the whole continuum of imperialism, the space-time continuum, and to trace forward the coherence of a certain extractivist logic from past to present in order to strategize the way forward by breaking the logic, by dismantling the narrative itself. So if we look at financialization and its racialized and gendered manifestations as a civilizing mission, a kind of colonial civilizing mission, that has its disciplining mechanisms, such as credit rating agencies that discipline, macroeconomic surveillance reports that keep sort of a report card check on developing countries, and the constant risk of the access to credit, then we see the logic and pattern behind financialization and the way it is enforced. So then we see climate change, not just from fossil capitalism, which is the last several decades or the last 120 years, but then we see it from 500 years of ecological imperialism. And that means centuries of commodity extraction from cotton, timber, sugar, spices across colonies that eroded not only ecological health, but also rights, equity, and very existence of indigenous communities well before the fossil capitalism. So then we understand how the wealth of nations, so to speak, or global inequalities understood by the history of a certain kind of systematic extraction. So I give an example, one of my favorite examples that I really love, that really puts the point home. Indian economist Utsa Patnaik in 2018 calculated that the British Empire had drained nearly 45 trillion pounds, 45 trillion sterling pounds from India between 1765 to 1938. This is a period just less than 200 years. So in perspective, 45 trillion today is 20 times the GDP of the UK. So this is not simply a historical travesty about the amount of money that was drained, but this is about looking at that wealth transfer as what created the settler colonies of North America, South Africa, Australia. This is the wealth transfer that diffused the capital, resources, technologies, the grants, the long-term loans, all the kinds of resources made available to Europe after World War II. This is the base of the wealth transfer that then allowed for the so-called advanced economies to industrialize and maintain economic power. So that was then, but what about now? Empirical research conducted by academics in 2018 quantifies financial drain from the global south through unequal exchange since 1960, just 50 years ago, amounting to 62 trillion. And when accounting for lost growth in the south, 152 trillion. And we know about illicit financial flows. The UN is one of the central places for the advocacy of a global tax body with universal participation. And we know that the tax outflows from the south are approximately 7.8 trillion in the 10-year period between 2004 to 2013, and especially in Africa. So one of the key points here is in reparations, what we're trying to say is that the 20th century, the last 100 or so years, may have dismantled technically colonialism's juridical and political institutions, but its logic and systemic organization of governance and unequal power relations not only prevail, but reproduce and expand in the more organized transglobal institutional structures of the Bretton Woods institutions, as well as the system of debt and austerity. So these reparations activists and movements remind us that this colonial amnesia, the way that colonialism is just not talked about in international development, is rarely talked about in UN policy and intergovernmental negotiations. It's not simply an act of ignorance or forgetting of the colonial past. It's a deliberate act of dissociating the links between past and present, between donor lender and recipient borrower. And so this allows for not only the material and technological superiority of the global north and its legitimacy as status of aid donor rather than reparations debtor, but it also leaves the public face of the North in terms of morality and historical culpability intact. And this is really the key point, that we are looking at the long durations in order to flip and switch the very frame that we're operating in. So here I want to really give a spotlight on debt colonialism, and that debt justice as a systemic transformation. One of our key demands in global economic and feminist justice is inherently tied to a reparations movement, and that debt justice and economic reparations, as well as climate reparations, are inextricably tied together. So we know today we have a historic debt crisis. More than 60 nations in the South are directing more of their public financial resources already under duress, already under strain from economic downturn, from higher interest rates, from food and fuel inflation, from all of the capital outflows currently occurring, to the strain on the foreign exchange reserves, the stronger dollar, which means higher cost of borrowing. Paying back debt is more expensive when the domestic currency depreciates, which tends to happen every time the dollar gets stronger, because much of the world is under a kind of US dollar hegemony or US dollar imperialism, where the US dollar, when it moves up or down, impacts the exchange rates of all developing countries. So we see right now a sort of perfect storm of economic imperialism, where that, unequal impact, the way in which the South is really affected in unequal ways, depending on what is happening in the North. Now, what is happening with the Federal Reserve in particular, and the way the interest rate has been going up, they are responding to inflation in North America. The European Central Bank is responding to inflation in Europe. A big part of that creation of that inflation is the fiscal stimulus in the rich countries. So it's their very own fiscal stimulus that they're responding to. Of course, the war in Ukraine is a big part of it, but let's not forget, when you pump out this many trillions of dollars and euros in the fiscal stimulus, it's going to impact the inflation as well. So we see here how the developing world without agency stands at a 50-year high with debt. 60% of low-income countries are in debt distress or high risk of debt distress. So many countries have defaulted and will be defaulting. We hear all the time the institutions that were part of creating this, like the IMF, saying that over the next 12 months, as many as a dozen developing economies may go into default. We hear about this cascade of debt defaults. And what has the response been? The G20 is the self-appointed governance body. They have been absolutely insufficient. In fact, they have been completely inept. They created a very tokenistic debt service suspension initiative that was just supposed to suspend the debt temporarily, but the private creditors did participate. So it was duly noted this was just passing the buck from the debt that was suspended by the bilateral official creditors going straight into the pockets of the richest creditors in the world. The private creditors also will not participate in the common framework. Right now, the only kind of mechanism for restructuring the debt and the principle, they call it comparability of treatment, where all creditors, multilateral, bilateral, private, come together and agree to the same terms of restructuring. The private sector is not agreeing for comparability of treatment. So on top of it, many countries don't even want to do debt restructuring because it sends a negative message to the creditors and financial markets. We have countries like Zambia waiting more than 18 months for restructuring their debt, much of their debt being held by BlackRock, which feminists have been putting their attention on, is one of the biggest asset management companies that hold so much of the private debt of developing countries. The private debt has really risen in the last 20, 30 years, but especially since the global financial crisis of 2007 and 8. A big reason why this private debt has just boomed and has changed the landscape of debt as from bilateral and multilateral to now majority private lenders, private creditors, is because of the enormous quantitative easing that the rich countries did after the global financial crisis. You had all of these trillions of credit liquidity going into the financial markets, that interest rates in the rich countries were very low. Interest rates in developing countries were quite high because that's one of the things that developing countries do to comply with the priorities and the interests of creditors. High interest rates, low fiscal deficits, low inflations, creating the enabling environment that creditors would like for investment. And that seems to be, the way in which the global imperialism works today, is that most developing countries go over and above to maintain an enabling environment for investment and lending from the financial markets that favor their interests. And that then systematically is at the expense of economic and social needs, investment in SDGs and climate, investment in rights and equity, in wealth redistribution, in social transfers, in universal social protection system. So these things are not happening by accident or a fluke. When the enabling environment is focused on creditor interests, it is at the expense of people's interests. And it does boil down to creditors versus people. And in that way, the Occupy Wall Street slogan of 1%, 99% is quite accurate. So we look at this very, very, very insufficient response to the debt architecture. We see that the money has gone, public money has gone to the private creditors. We see that private creditors are not willing to participate. We see countries with debt distress from Nigeria to Ghana not taking the risk of seeking debt relief because they don't want to send the signal to international financial markets, to credit rating agencies, that they may be impending debt default. Why? Because if they send a sign that they might go into debt default, it would raise their already high borrowing rates. Or worse, the ultimate threat is to be cut off from international financial markets altogether, to be cut off from market access to credit. And the market access to credit is sort of a looming narrative that hangs over the global economy as the ultimate risk, as the ultimate sort of quote unquote economic suicide. You don't want to risk that. By any means, you don't want to risk that, because all countries need access to credit. So this is part of the mechanisms that are going on, that are creating that wealth drain from south to north, that are creating that systematic depletion of financial resources. And at the heart of it, it is about what is being normalized, what is being expected by the South to ensure economic survival. And at the core, it is continual debt repayments. Sri Lanka continued to honor its debt repayments even when their foreign exchange reserves and their public financial revenue was hitting such a low point that the ability to import basic grains, basic fuel, was really coming under serious distress. Even when importing the basic food is coming under threat, the country still was maintaining, repaying foreign debt. So we must then stop and sort of see the world as it is. We are in a global economy where repayment of debt precedes all maintenance of human life. I mean, human life in terms of existential survival, food in the current moment. So where and how do we then talk about climate change and adaptation financing when this structural power exercised by political creditors exercises so much political influence over the national autonomy and the economic sovereignty of the global South? So ultimately, it's a question of economic sovereignty, the way in which countries have to assure market confidence and demonstrate sound macroeconomic fundamentals for financial markets, and what that requires for the country itself. Oftentimes today, we are seeing a resurgence of the austerity era. It is structural adjustment redux. We are seeing pro-cyclical macroeconomic policy and fiscal austerity that is about regressive taxation for value-added goods and services taxes disproportionately impacting women. Public sector wage cuts and expenditure reductions, especially in health, education, and social protection, disproportionately impacting women and children. Care economy burdens, time poverty, exacerbates when public services are not available to support women's unpaid labor in the care, in the social reproductive economy, in the maintenance of society. The public services that the state is not providing, women's bodies are carrying out. Women's bodies are de facto carrying out a sort of embodied debt owed by the state and foreign creditors to the bodies of women who uphold the entire economy and society by their unremunerated and consistent labor, not just in terms of provisioning, but in terms of the emotional, mental, psychological, spiritual labor that women have been putting forward in the last several years, especially, but throughout time and history. And we're also seeing privatization, labor market deregulation, all of it disproportionately impacting women. So this every dollar spent servicing debt, be it to the World Bank, to a private bondholder, to a Chinese state-backed development bank, a state-backed development bank, is a dollar not spent on public health. It's a dollar not spent on climate adaptation, improved sanitation, or the various other public services that communities need. So what are the solutions? I'll end here with some solutions. Many of the systemic transformation calls for not just reform, but structural change. have been long proposed by civil society. And this structural change recognizes that both the world economy and the climate crises were built by colonialism and slavery. It's recognizing that carbon emissions caused by the Industrial Revolution has been disproportionately from the north, and that the political and economic structures that even maintain the present fossil fuel energy system is reflecting a balance of power inherited from colonialism and then built into the multinational corporations and institutions that govern world economy. So we're looking at, really considering structural change that is reparative of colonial history. And what would that structural change look like? For example, one of the key aspects of structural change is first and foremost to revamp the international debt architecture towards not just the technical aspects of cancellation and debt workout mechanism, but towards a kind of building economic sovereignty by South-South cooperation, regional solidarity, and by turning away from the kind of trade and financial liberalization that makes the South so vulnerable to the North, to create that self-sufficiency and sovereignty and resilience from within. And that means directing the resources to food security, to food justice, to social investments, to building local industries, to small industries, woman-owned businesses. And it also, of course, is about a debt workout mechanism. I think most of you are very familiar with the multilateral framework for debt crisis resolution that addresses unsustainable and illegitimate debt by providing systematic, timely, and fair restructuring of the debt in a process that convenes all creditors, bilateral, multilateral, private. We know our colleagues from APMDD and many others around the world have long called for debt cancellation, not just cancellation, but unconditional cancellation, immediate and ambitious cancellation that leaves national resources in the country, and to see that as the optimal solution at the core of debt justice, leave the resources in the country. A key point with climate vulnerability is the debts of 19 of the 20 most climate vulnerable countries are held by majority official public creditors. And this makes debt relief much more possible when it's public creditors rather than private. Another key systemic demand is to meet climate financing commitments and to scale up future commitments by creating grant-based liquidity. And that means meeting the commitments by the public financial resources of the North, but avoiding the kind of green financialization where the private sector starts doing leveraged loans and investments in the South, and to really look at solutions that provide liquidity that is unconditional, that provide financing that is unconditional and non-debt creating, and to hold these two principles as common but differentiated responsibilities, as central as polluter pays, unconditional and non-debt creating. We need a UN global tax body, or we need to reroute the fiscal policy away from austerity and towards long-term public investment in social sectors, because there needs to be a narrative now that public sector resilience is indispensable for climate, for feminist justice, for rights-based economy, and for economic justice. And that would be, I think, a foundation of economic reparations. Of course, there are many other reforms, many other from global trade rules, investment treaties, free flow of financial flows, capital account regulations, to create publicly owned and multilateral credit rating agencies. But I conclude with one kind of advocacy that might be interesting to consider, and that is the way in which central banks can develop regulations that limit private creditors' ability to do aggressive, predatory, vulture fund kind of debt? What kind of policies can we put in place? What kind of rules and regulations and resistance on private creditors? I think the question of how to deal with this enormous power of private creditors to decide not to participate in debt restructuring, to have the arrogance and the the bullying attitude that we will not restructure the debt. How to deal with that through serious binding rules and ways in which the economic institutions such as central banks, such as the International Court of Justice, even legal bodies, how can they hold private creditors accountable? And that needs to be at the core of, and it already is, at the social movements really looking at the private creditors, naming and shaming them, exposing them, and making that very clear that they cannot keep getting away with predatory behavior. So I leave it at that, and really interested in hearing other suggestions, ideas, critiques on how private creditors can be held to account in a more systematic way. Thanks for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Bhumika. I could not interrupt because this is precisely what we want to hear, right? The demands and the alternatives. And thank you for highlighting that we should be looking at the whole continuum of imperialism. And actually, my favorite phrase from Bhumika sharing is dismantling the narrative and challenging colonial amnesia, no? As we are fighting a long history and continuum of colonial oppressions, and how this has created the neoliberal and imperialist system that we have today, and of course the needed structural change. Okay, so again, if anyone have questions or reactions, I know that is a very powerful first sharing, answering our big questions. So please use the chat box or wait for the Q&A later. And also just to note, our interpreters have a request if the speakers can speak slowly so they can effectively interpret. Okay, so for our next big question, the question of transformation and economic justice. Now we have Emilia. So we would like to ask Emilia. So recently, there have been increasing proposals for degrowth, specifically aimed towards rich countries in the global north. So what is degrowth, and how does this proposal aim to transform our economic system, and how does degrowth connect to resource justice? So Emilia, the floor is yours.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me, for inviting me to this session. Always the women's major group leading the way into very key conversations that we need to have. So I'm very grateful also that I'm following Bhumika. Many of the landscape she has portrayed already is going to be very helpful in what I'm going to present. And also, I just want to take us all back into the drafting of the SDGs. When in the women's major group, we started with the mock drafts. And every time we used to see the word growth in the draft that was posed by the co-chairs and then proposed in language by all of the member states, we used to delete the word growth. We just strike through, and we said we don't want any more growth. Growth is harmful for the planet. And we said we want sustainable development, or we tried to find many other options, or we just kept a list of what we wanted, and we strike through the word growth consistently. There was not one single draft produced by the women's major group throughout the entire negotiations, from the open working group to the approval of the SDGs, where we let pass our questioning of the system that the United Nations and the member states were promoting. So So we've always had a very strong critique of the notion of growth. We've always had a very strong questioning of the GDP as a measure for the state of a nation, the state of well-being of people, and the way to measure the state of the health of the planet. As Bhumika always reminds us, there is also this ranking of knowledge in which there is this epistemic racism in which only traditions of the global north are recognized in the global canon, whereas the southern interpretations of history, the creation of knowledge, of theories, and of proposals of transformation have been left aside. But just have to say that this critique of growth comes from the global south, from many traditions in the world, in different regions. It has taken different names and different facets. In Latin America, we hear the Buen Vivir. In Africa, Ubuntu proposals, etc. So each region and even each sub-region has come up with some proposals and some ways on naming what is it that societies, what are the ways in which societies can escape this neoliberal, extractive, and oppressive system of relation within the human bonds, but also with the planet. And this has led, of course, to a lot of knowledge produced at the local level, especially in referring to circular, local well-being, etc. And all of these are proposals of possibility of new economies. But I want to remind us all, as always, that especially more in this context of this macroeconomic conversation of today, that the macro dimension is totally key because it sometimes crushes the possibilities of the local space. So at the macro level, and of course that is reflected as a fractal in the micro and the local, we see that there are three main subsidies that are happening in the world to sustain the type of lifestyle and the economic neoliberal capitalistic system that prevails nowadays. The first of all, we all know this, is the subsidy that women do to the global economy due to their unpaid domestic and care work. I always keep this background, some background. Behind the yellow segment is all of the subsidy that women are doing, the value that's generated by unpaid domestic and care work. And this segment is the amount of the formal economy, the monetized economy. The second subsidy is the one that the global south is doing to the global north. Bhumika has spoken very sharply with lots of figures to prove the subsidy to the global north that is done by the global south. And the third subsidy is a subsidy that indigenous peoples are doing to life in the planet currently, being them 6% of the population and upholding 80% of the biodiversity in the world. If it weren't for them, life in this planet would have been eradicated as we know it. And there would be no possibility for our Western societies to keep on producing. And on the other hand, it is our Western societies, the ones that have been destroying life in this planet in a manner that is obscene and is taking us to the risk of extinction. So these three subsidies should be totally related to what Bhumika had just mentioned, but also take us to rethink framings of how are we going to deal with these macro dynamics, right? And actually, most of the discourses of degrowth, that's where I'm going to try to get into now. Most of the discourses of degrowth, as I was saying, come from this point of entry of circular, local, the community, etc. But there are especially some proposals that have been arising as of late. Well, first of all, I just want to say this circular local, of course, relates to this discourse of the global south subsidizing the global north. So it's not, it hasn't been necessarily depleted from this notion of macro, but it is true that has been in the latest years where the work on ecological economy has been strengthening this dialogue, that the discourses of degrowth have been focusing more on the responsibility of the global north. And you will find many traditions of thoughts, the way we see it in our feminist traditions. There are many debates internally on the degrowth circles. So as I was saying, many of them, most of them focus on local and micro. Some of them manage to reach some regional ways of relation, but it is up to late with the ecological economy and the data that has been gathered by the latest scientists in the huge reports on the ecological destruction, that the degrowth tradition has been very helpful in promoting specific solutions and also a proposal of hope. So, so this is why Equidad is part of those few voices that are calling for degrowth, but specifically for degrowth, one, for the wealthy nations, second, for the wealthy elites in those wealthy nations and also at the global level, three, at the sectorial level in those and economical activities that are superficial and that are impacting negatively the health of the planet. So these 3 points of entry are key, because many of the questions that we received, like, why do you want to degrow the economies of Malawi or the LDCs? It's like, no, those of us who are calling for degrowth at this moment in relation to ecological economy are calling very specifically to degrow the patterns of consumption and production of the global north that is destroying the life of people in the planet. And we cannot detach it with concentration of wealth, but just let me say, we all have the data. 92% of the carbon emissions that have been emitted that are generated the climate emergency come from the global north. 92%. This aligns with the debate on debt that Bhumika was saying, because contrary to what the economic dynamics are imposing developing countries, we know that those who have a historical debt with humanity and the planet is the global north. And this is why all of the principles of CBDR, polluter space, but also further into taking into reparations and restitution and many other elements that we need to debate as feminists and to pose at the center, precisely because of this responsibility of the global north of destroying the life in the planet, should be front and center in every conversation. There's another debate that is not necessarily always recognized, that is the one of resource justice. And I just gonna say that I owe this term of resource justice to Jane Mayrofer and May Volger from Friends of the Earth. This discussion is referring to the way in which the global north keeps extracting everything: time, natural resources, all of the minerals, etc., every production that is made in the global south to support the type of life that they have in the global north. So just want to say that, and this agenda of resource justice is key, and I'm going to explain why in a minute with a graphic. But this is key because the destruction of the biodiversity in the world is happening precisely because the extractive and predatory dynamics of the current economies. And this distraction is coming precisely from the drivers to sustain the global north lifestyle, and it amounts to 73% of the entire resource extraction in the world. We call it resource use, material resource use. So 73% of the resource use is done by the global north to support its lifestyle. So you have to see also, paired up with the amount of carbon emissions, that the amount of destruction of the biodiversity integrity is due to this obscene criminal lifestyle that the global north countries are having. So this poses a lot of questions in terms of, for instance, the proposals to agree on a paradigm of clean energy, green energy, and all of those stuff. Because green energy is, first of all, if we don't change the paradigm of growth, it will keep on promoting this unfair dimension. Actually, in the Lancet and in other papers, scientific papers, they have proven that all of the scenarios considered in the IPCC report never once question that the global north will keep on exploiting and extracting value, wealth, and resources from the global south. They maintain the percentage of growth of the global north in all of these scenarios. And that means that there is not once a consideration of a shifting of a system change. Therefore, it's very problematic that even the paradigms of the scenarios of the IPCC report keep on maintaining this colonial logic in which the global south and the life in the planet are there to support the obscene concentration of wealth in the global north countries. So of course, these measures come first in a disaggregated manner towards north and south. So this is why we are indeed calling for degrowth in the global north countries, in the wealthier countries. And of course, internally, we see that there is a difference in inequalities in the global north. And this is why we're also wanted to be very sharp in calling for degrowth for the wealthier, in the sense of this private accumulation, in which I think the latest figure we had is the private capital is 300% larger globally than the public funding. And again, in a more disaggregated manner, we're trying to focus on what are the sectors that need to degrow, so that we're not saying everything needs to cut down, as in the notion of austerity that Bhumika also explained very well. It is actually the opposite. It is cutting back in all of the spaces where are the concentration of wealth and the luxuries that are impacting negatively the well-being of people and the planet are reduced in order to promote public services and other proposals of policy that are useful for the collective well-being. Just want to say a definition of degrowth that Jason Hickel poses in his book, but come from Georgios Kallis and many other degrowthers, that it's a planned reduction of excess energy and resource use. You hear there are the two components, excess energy and resource use, to bring the economy back into balance with the living world in a safe, just, and equitable way. It's a definition in his book, Less is More. But just wanted to go very quickly into explaining why we need to have a broader understanding of our demands in terms to the economic agenda and the environmental one. I don't know if you can see my screen. You can see this. Great. So just wanted to say that this graphic comes from the Stockholm Resilience Institute. And this is something that as feminists, we are mandated to know. This, what they are talking about is 9 planetary boundaries. And they're saying how all of these points of entry of analyzing the environment, they have found that there are these 9 key pillars or 9 structures that are interconnected, but there are 2 that are kind of not cross-cutting, but they are key to pull the other ones. One is climate change, and the other is the biosphere integrity or the biodiversity integrity. So what they're saying is that the planet has these boundaries. If we go above, the boundaries are, the planet has its way to find a balance and to reintegrate, to recover itself from any harm that is done to it. And that safe operating space is in the green area of the chart. You can't see it here in this one that I've chosen, but they have also a yellow one outside the green. That is their risk space. This means that if we can go into this green area in exploiting the nature, and we are in this yellow area in which it is uncertain what are the effects that we're going to have. And going above that yellow, we're going into the red zone, which is totally breakdown of that planetary boundaries. You can see the boundaries here: climate change, biosphere integrity, or as I said, biodiversity integrity, land system change, novel entities. This refers to plastic pollution, chemical pollution, biogeochemical, ocean acidification, atmospheric aerosol loading, stratospheric ozone depletion, and freshwater change. You can see that we are almost in the red in 5 of the 9. And as I said, specifically, we should be concerned with climate change and biosphere integrity, because those 2, when going above the risk scenario, those 2 will pull the rest of the other 9 planetary boundaries into a zone outside of the safe operating space, and will take us into the risk, and probably also going above the planetary boundaries. So as you can see in climate change, we are in the border of yellow. We are going in the top of, we are almost going to the top, because we know that 1.5 is the limit towards breaking the planetary boundary of climate change, and we will go into a totally increasing risk of breaking that boundary. Actually, the IPCC report has very tricky language in which the scientists say that we only have until 2025 to reduce the climate emissions, but that is because the global north countries refuse to accept that we are already at the verge. So we don't even have 3 years. It is now. We need to stop it now, today, and we haven't done so. But even without the risk of climate change, you can see that the graphic in biosphere integrity is really, really above the latest frontier, and that refers to 2 elements. One is the destruction of the ecosystem integrity. All of the ecosystems have been torn down precisely because of the extraction, not only of mining, but also the huge destruction that is happening because of the agricultural patterns of monoculture, etc. But also the mining in the sea, in the Arctic, etc. But the other one is about the species extinction, and we see both in plants and the animals, there is a huge extinction. This element is still to be measured, but biosphere integrity is totally above the limits. Land system change is also above the risks area. Novel entities such as plastic, those of you who work in UNEA, you know that these boundaries, as you can see, is way over the top, as well as biogeochemical, and ocean acidification is about to reach also the boundaries. So what we're trying to say, just in June this year, the freshwater change was proved that it already went above the limits. So we're talking about a major destruction of the planet. And this is why in Equidad, we don't want to talk about climate emergencies anymore. We want to talk about the environmental emergency. We don't want to talk about climate finance. We want to talk about environmental finance and to address this with the responsibility that is due. And all of this is referred to, of course, again, going back to the way the global north, the wealthy elites in the global north, and all of those sectors that keep on exploiting our planet are taking us on the verge of extinction. Some scientists are saying that human extinction is coming in 2040. And this is precisely because of the massive acceleration of not only one element, but everything is interconnected. So I think my time is up, but just wanted to say on resource use that we are calling as well for a measure to cap, fee, and divest, to put a cap on every element of extraction at the local, at the national, at the regional level, to capping all sorts of minerals, all sorts of natural resources. And whenever there is an infraction of that cap, there has to be a fee that needs to be paid. And that fee can also be helped to divest towards the investment on reparations, on redistribution. On our end, also the issue of reparation needs to come here very strongly, because we think that the issue of loss and damage is at the heart of the reparations, and there is no money in ODA. However, the call for loss and damage finance under the UNFCCC framework is not going to be enough. It's not going to happen because there is not enough ODA in the world to pay for what we're asking. We're calling for trillions. It's not going to happen that way. The trillions are in the system. So we need to regulate the banking systems that is pouring the trillions into fossil fuels, into mining, etc. But we need a total shift. I just want to close by saying that there is a very interesting debate, because the growthers are totally against Green New Deals, anything green, because in all of the scenarios they have played, green is not enough. We cannot green our economy. We need to take it down. And this is why the proposals for degrowth. So Bhumika and I need to have a lot of conversations about this. But of course, when we were talking about feminism and the colonial global Green New Deal, we were talking about many of these issues already. We just, I think, need to reshift the way in which we're conceiving that. And of course, the growthers are not considering all of the other elements that from the Women's Working Group and many of our colleagues here have been considering. So but they have come up with new proposals, and more importantly, with a real and hopeful path towards recovering our planet. And the best example is the stratospheric ozone depletion. Do you remember in the 80s, we were about to break down the ozone layer, and due to very tough reforms, we got it closed back again. So there is historical proof that we can take these planetary boundaries back to the safe operating space, but that takes really a lot of strong effort that is structural in shifting from a capitalistic extractive way, but also targeting those who are responsible. So just gonna finish here saying that citizens in the global north need to take account that the utmost battle needs to happen in their territories. They need to take up into the streets. They need to take up this discussion into the streets in the communities with their decision makers, and they need to stand at the forefront. The ultimate battle for saving the planet is going to happen in their territories, because no matter how much the global south keeps on fighting, the decision making is there. And we see that even the fascist discourse is gaining in the global north, because global north citizens are absent from any construction of community space in their national territories. So this is a plea as well to start working in the global north, but with a vision that is decolonial and that is coming from the knowledge of the global south. So I'm gonna leave it here and look very much forward to the conversation.